The child Pharaoh could not destroy. Before Moses stood before Pharaoh, before the waters of the sea divided, and before a nation gathered beneath the thunder of Mount Sinai, he was a child marked for death. He was born into a world where his people had no army, no king, and no homeland of their own. They lived inside the borders of the most powerful kingdom they knew, serving an empire whose monuments seemed permanent and whose ruler claimed authority over life and death. Pharaoh had ordered that Hebrew sons be thrown into the Nile. Yet the very river intended to become an instrument of death would carry one child into the household of Pharaoh himself. That child would grow up between two worlds. He would receive the privileges of Egypt while carrying the blood of Israel. He would know the halls of royal power, but he would eventually choose to identify with an enslaved people. His first attempt to act on their behalf would end not in liberation, but in bloodshed, fear, and exile. Long before Moses became Israel's deliverer, he became a fugitive. And before he could confront the ruler of Egypt, he would first have to lose the life Egypt had given him. The story of Moses begins generations before his birth. The family of Jacob, also called Israel, had come to Egypt during a severe famine. Jacob's son Joseph had risen to authority under an earlier Pharaoh and had helped preserve both Egypt and his own family through years of scarcity. Because of Joseph's service, Jacob's household had been welcomed into the land. They settled in the region of Goshen, where they raised their livestock and grew into a larger community. But Joseph died. His brothers died. The generation that remembered how the Hebrews had arrived in Egypt also passed away. Centuries of history can change the meaning of a people's presence. Guests can become strangers. Neighbors can become threats. A family remembered for saving a nation can later be viewed as a population that must be controlled. The book of Exodus tells us that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Whether this means he had literally never heard Joseph's name, or that he no longer recognized any obligation to Joseph's descendants, the result was the same. The Hebrews were no longer protected by the memory of the past. They had become numerous. Their families were growing and their population was spreading. Pharaoh looked at them, not with gratitude, but with fear. He warned that if war came, the Israelites might join Egypt's enemies, fight against the kingdom, and escape from the land. His concern was political, but his solution was brutal. Egypt placed taskmasters over the Hebrews and forced them into labor. They built storage cities for Pharaoh. They worked with mortar and brick. They labored in fields and construction projects under harsh supervision. Their lives became bitter beneath an organized system of oppression. The biblical account does not describe slavery as an unfortunate accident. It presents it as a deliberate policy imposed by a ruler who feared losing control. Yet oppression produced the opposite of what Pharaoh intended. The more the Israelites were afflicted, the more they multiplied. Their survival became an accusation against the limits of Pharaoh's power. He could increase their labor. He could make their lives unbearable. But he could not stop them from becoming a people. Egypt's fear deepened. Pharaoh then commanded 2 Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill male children at birth while allowing the daughters to live. The plan was designed to destroy Israel's future quietly, one delivery at a time. But the midwives feared God more than they feared the king. They did not obey Pharaoh's command. When questioned, they answered that the Hebrew women gave birth before the midwives could reach them. The text records that God dealt well with the midwives, and the people continued to increase. 2 women without armies or official authority had resisted the command of the most powerful man in Egypt. Their courage did not end the danger, however. Pharaoh moved from a secret order to a public decree. Every Hebrew son was to be thrown into the Nile. The river was central to Egyptian life. Its waters supported agriculture, transportation, and the survival of the kingdom. But under Pharaoh's command, that source of life was turned against the children of Israel. It was in this atmosphere that a Levite man and woman had a son. Later scripture identifies them as Amram and Jochebed. They already had at least 2 children, a daughter named Miriam and a son named Aaron. When Jochebed gave birth to another boy, she saw that he was a fine child and hid him for 3 months. The Bible does not describe those months in detail. It does not tell us how often the family feared footsteps outside their home, how they silenced the child's cries, or how many neighbors knew their secret. But the danger surrounding them is clear. Every additional day increased the risk that someone would discover the infant. Eventually, Jochebed could hide him no longer. She prepared a small basket made from papyrus reeds and coated it with bitumen and pitch so that it would resist the water. The Hebrew word used for this basket is related to the word used for Noah's Ark. In both stories, judgment surrounds human life, and the carefully prepared vessel becomes the means through which that life is preserved. Jochebed placed her son inside and set the basket among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. This was not abandonment without hope. The basket was placed where it could remain among the vegetation rather than being released helplessly into the river's current. Miriam stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen. Then Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe at the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent one of her attendants to retrieve it. When she opened it, she found the child crying. She recognized that he was a Hebrew boy. That detail matters. She could not have mistaken the meaning of his presence. A hidden Hebrew infant near the Nile existed because of her father's decree. She was looking at a child whom the ruler of Egypt had condemned, yet she had compassion on him. At the moment Pharaoh's command reached toward the infant, compassion inside Pharaoh's own household intervened. Miriam stepped forward and offered to find a Hebrew woman who could nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and Miriam brought the boy's own mother. Jochebed was then instructed to nurse the child and was paid for doing what she had risked her life to do in secret. For a time, Moses was returned to the arms of his mother under the protection of Pharaoh's daughter. The empire that had ordered his death now unknowingly financed his survival. When the child grew older, Jochebed brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying that she had drawn him out of the water. The name would follow him throughout his life. He had been drawn out of the Nile. One day, through him, an entire people would be drawn out of Egypt. But that day was still far away. Moses grew up within Pharaoh's household. The book of Exodus gives few details about his education or daily life in the palace. The New Testament book of Acts later states that Moses was instructed in the wisdom of the Egyptians and became powerful in words and deeds. Egypt possessed advanced systems of administration, architecture, agriculture, writing, mathematics, military organization, and religious ceremony. A man raised in connection with the royal court would have been exposed to a world very different from the labor settlements of the Hebrews. Moses would have seen authority from the inside. He would have understood how commands moved through officials, how resources were collected, and how royal power shaped the lives of thousands. He lived among people who benefited from the system that oppressed his birth family. Yet he did not forget who he was. Exodus tells us that when Moses had grown, he went out to his people and looked upon their burdens. They were still his people. Whatever privileges he had received in Egypt had not erased his connection to the Hebrews. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Moses looked in both directions. Seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian and killed him. He then hid the body in the sand. The act reveals both Moses' identification with the oppressed and the danger of acting through uncontrolled violence. He recognized injustice, but his response did not free Israel. It created another victim, concealed a killing, and placed Moses himself in danger. Scripture does not present this moment as the beginning of a successful revolution. It presents it as a failure. Moses had strength, access, and anger, but he did not yet have the calling, preparation, or authority necessary for the mission that would later define his life. The next day he went out again and saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. He asked the one in the wrong why he was striking his companion. The man answered by challenging Moses, who had made him a ruler and judge over them. Was Moses planning to kill him as he had killed the Egyptian? The hidden act was already known. Moses became afraid. The people he wished to defend did not automatically accept his authority. His position in Pharaoh's household could not protect him from the consequences of what he had done. And the death concealed beneath the sand had not remained secret. When Pharaoh heard about the killing, he sought to have Moses executed. In a single turn, Moses lost the world in which he had been raised. He could no longer remain safely in the palace. He could not disappear unnoticed among the Hebrews. He had acted against an Egyptian and had become a threat to the order Pharaoh intended to preserve. Moses fled from Egypt. The man once drawn from the Nile now crossed away from the river, away from the palace, and away from the enslaved people whose suffering had awakened his anger. He traveled toward the land of Midian. The exact route is not described, but the journey carried him beyond the immediate reach of Pharaoh's power and into a harsher landscape. Egypt's cultivated lands gave way to wilderness regions, where water was scarce, distances were dangerous, and survival depended on knowledge Moses may not yet have possessed. He eventually sat down beside a well. The scene was far removed from the royal environment of his upbringing. There was no court, no title, and no protection. Moses had become a stranger in a foreign land. 7 daughters of a priest of Midian came to draw water for their father's flock. Other shepherds arrived and drove them away. Once again, Moses saw the strong mistreating the vulnerable. This time, the biblical account does not say that he killed anyone. He defended the women and watered their flock. When the daughters returned home earlier than usual, their father asked how they had completed their work so quickly. They explained that an Egyptian had rescued them from the shepherds and had drawn water for the flock. To them, Moses appeared Egyptian. His clothing, speech, or manner may have reflected the life in which he had been raised. He carried Hebrew blood, but strangers recognized Egypt when they looked at him. Their father asked why they had left the man at the well and told them to invite him to eat. The priest is called Reuel in this passage and is later known as Jethro. Moses agreed to stay with him, and in time Jethro gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses as a wife. Moses and Zipporah had a son. Moses named him Gershom, a name associated with being a foreigner in a foreign land. The name expressed something deeper than geography. Moses had once lived in Egypt without fully belonging to the Egyptians. He had identified with the Hebrews, yet his attempt to intervene had been rejected. Now he lived in Midian, where he had found shelter and family, but he still understood himself as a stranger. The prince had become a shepherd. The man who may once have walked through royal buildings now moved through open country with flocks. His life no longer appeared connected to the fate of Egypt or Israel. Years began to pass. The Pharaoh who had sought Moses' life eventually died, but the death of one ruler did not end Israel's suffering. The people remained enslaved. They groaned under their bondage and cried out. Their cry rose to God. God heard them. The text declares that God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This does not mean that he had forgotten and suddenly recalled it as a person might remember a neglected promise. In biblical language, God's remembrance signals that the time had come for covenant faithfulness to move into visible action. God saw the people of Israel. God knew. While Moses lived in obscurity, the suffering in Egypt continued. While Israel wondered whether anyone heard their cries, the promise made to their ancestors had not disappeared. Moses may have believed that his opportunity to change anything had ended in the sand beside a dead Egyptian. But his failure had not placed him beyond God's reach. His exile had removed him from Pharaoh's palace, but it had also placed him in the wilderness, where he would learn the land, the silence, the isolation, and the work of guiding living creatures through dangerous territory. The shepherd did not yet know that he was being prepared to lead a nation. He did not yet know that he would return to the place from which he had fled. He did not yet know that Pharaoh's power would be challenged, that Egypt's gods would be humiliated, or that the Nile, which had carried him toward life, would one day become the first sign of judgment. For now Moses remained in Midian, a fugitive, a husband, a father, a shepherd living far from his people. But in the wilderness beyond Egypt, a fire was about to appear. A fire that burned without consuming what it touched, and from within that fire, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would call the fugitive by name, the shepherd and the burning bush. The wilderness had done what Pharaoh's palace never could. It had stripped Moses of rank security and the illusion that strength alone could change the fate of a people. Years passed in Midian. The man once associated with royal power now spent his days leading sheep across dry ground, searching for water, reading the weather, and guarding a flock that did not belong to him. The work was quiet, repetitive, and far removed from the suffering of Israel. Egypt may have felt like another life, but the cries of the Hebrews had not ended. Their labor continued beneath Egyptian taskmasters. Families were still formed under oppression. Children grew up knowing bondage as the only social order they had ever seen. One pharaoh died, but the system he represented remained. The people groaned under slavery and cried out. Their cry rose to God. The book of Exodus marks this moment with a series of deliberate statements. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel. God knew. The rescue of Israel would not begin because Moses suddenly rediscovered his ambition. It would begin because God remained faithful to a promise made generations earlier. One day, Moses led the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, beyond the usual grazing areas and came to Horeb, described as the mountain of God. The location would later become central to Israel's identity. It would be associated with Sinai, the place where a rescued people would receive the covenant that defined them as a nation. But Moses arrived there as a shepherd. No crowds waited for him. No army stood behind him. He was not seeking a vision or preparing to reclaim his former position. He was caring for sheep. Then he saw fire. A bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. In the wilderness, fire itself was not impossible. Dry vegetation could ignite quickly. But this flame behaved differently. It continued to burn without destroying the bush that held it. Moses turned aside to examine the sight. That movement appears small, but it marks the beginning of the mission that would reshape his life. He noticed something he could not explain, and instead of passing by, he approached. When God saw that Moses had turned aside, he called to him from within the bush. "Moses! Moses!" The fugitive's name was spoken twice. Moses answered, "Here I am." God warned him not to come closer and commanded him to remove his sandals because the ground on which he stood was holy. The soil itself was not naturally different from the surrounding wilderness. It was holy because God had made his presence known there. Moses was then told that the one speaking to him was the God of his father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The man raised among Egypt's religious symbols was not encountering another local deity tied to one river city or region. He was standing before the God connected to the covenant history of his own ancestors. God declared that he had seen the suffering of his people in Egypt. He had heard their cries because of their taskmasters. He knew their pain. Then came the announcement Israel had long needed to hear. God had come down to deliver them from Egypt and bring them into a good and spacious land, a land described as flowing with milk and honey. It was the territory associated with the Canaanites and several other peoples already living there. The promise was not merely an escape from suffering. Israel would be brought out in order to be brought into something. Freedom would lead toward covenant land worship and responsibility. Then God spoke the command that changed everything for Moses. I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. The shepherd was being sent back to the empire from which he had fled. Moses' first response was not confidence. Who am I, he asked, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? The question may have carried many layers. Who was he now? He was no longer a member of Pharaoh's household. He had no official authority in Egypt. He had once tried to defend the Hebrew and had become a murderer and fugitive. The Israelites themselves had questioned his right to act as ruler and judge over them. The mission seemed to require precisely the position Moses had lost. But God did not answer by reminding Moses of his education courage or unusual background. He answered with a promise. I will be with you. That was the foundation of Moses' authority, not his past, not his ability, not his access to Pharaoh's court. The mission would succeed because the God who sent him would remain with him. God also gave Moses a sign, but it was a sign that would be fully understood only after obedience. When Moses had brought the people out of Egypt, they would worship God on that very mountain. Moses was standing at the place where the mission would one day be confirmed. He had come there with sheep. He would return with a nation. Still, Moses hesitated. He imagined himself appearing before the Israelites and telling them that the God of their ancestors had sent him. What if they asked for God's name? What should he say? God answered with words that have remained among the most discussed statements in Scripture. I am who I am. Moses was to tell Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also identified himself by the covenant name, often represented in English translations as the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This was to be his name through generations. The statement did not reduce God to a definition that Moses could control. It revealed divine independence, faithfulness, and enduring existence. The God who was sending Moses did not depend on Egypt, Pharaoh, or any other power. Empires rise because circumstances permit them to rise. Rulers hold authority for a limited time, but the one speaking from the flame did not receive existence or power from anyone. God instructed Moses to gather Israel's elders and tell them that the God of their ancestors had appeared to him. He was to announce that God had seen what Egypt had done and had promised to bring them into the land of Canaan. The elders would listen. Then Moses and the elders were to go before Pharaoh and ask permission to travel into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord. God also warned Moses that Pharaoh would not let the people go unless compelled by a mighty hand. The confrontation ahead was not hidden from him. Pharaoh would resist. Egypt would be struck with wonders, and when Israel finally left, the people would not depart empty-handed. Egyptian women would give them silver, gold, and clothing, and the former slaves would carry wealth out of the land that had exploited their labor. The outcome had been declared. But Moses continued to look at the obstacles. What if Israel did not believe him? What if they refused to listen and said that the Lord had not appeared to him? God asked Moses what he held in his hand. A staff, Moses answered. It was an ordinary object from his life as a shepherd. It represented the work he had been doing during the years that seemed disconnected from Israel's future. God told him to throw it on the ground. When Moses did so, the staff became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. God commanded him to reach out and take it by the tail. When Moses obeyed, it became a staff again in his hand. The sign was meant to help Israel believe that the God of their fathers had truly appeared to Moses. Then God gave him another sign. Moses placed his hand inside his cloak. When he removed it, the hand was diseased, appearing white as snow. He placed it back inside, and when he drew it out again, it had been restored. If the people did not believe the first sign, they might believe the second. If they rejected both, Moses was told to take water from the Nile and pour it onto dry ground. The water would become blood. The Nile was not merely a geographical feature, it was the lifeline of Egypt. Its waters sustained the fields, cities, and wealth of the kingdom. The first public signs already pointed toward a larger confrontation. What Egypt trusted could be transformed. What appeared stable could become an instrument of judgment. Moses still resisted. He told God that he was not eloquent. He had never been a man of words, and even after this encounter, he remained slow of speech and tongue. The exact nature of Moses' difficulty is not explained. It may have referred to an actual speech limitation, a lack of confidence, or his belief that he could not speak persuasively enough for the task. Whatever the reason, Moses viewed communication as a weakness that disqualified him. God answered by directing Moses beyond himself. Who had made the human mouth? Who made a person mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Was it not the Lord God, promised to be with Moses' mouth and teach him what to say? The answer did not deny Moses' weakness. It declared that weakness did not limit the one who had called him. Yet Moses reached the point where his objections could no longer be presented as requests for information. He pleaded, "Please send someone else." Fear had become refusal. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Still, mercy accompanied the rebuke. God told him that his brother Aaron, the Levite, could speak well. Aaron was already coming to meet him and would be glad when he saw him. Moses would speak God's words to Aaron, and Aaron would speak to the people. God would be with both men and teach them what to do. Moses would take the staff with which the signs would be performed. The staff of a shepherd was about to become the visible instrument through which acts of divine power would be announced before Israel and Egypt. Aaron would become Moses' spokesman, but this arrangement also revealed something important about leadership in the story ahead. Moses would not carry the mission alone. Aaron would stand beside him before Pharaoh. Miriam would later help lead Israel in worship. Elders, priests, judges, craftsmen, and tribal leaders would all become part of the nation's journey. Moses was central, but the story was never meant to be built on one man acting without community or accountability. The fire remained. The bush still did not burn away, and Moses, who had approached as a shepherd, left the encounter as a man under command. He returned to Jethro and asked permission to go back to Egypt to see whether his relatives were still alive. Jethro told him to go in peace. The biblical account records that God assured Moses that the men who had sought his life were dead. The immediate danger connected to his earlier crime had passed. But returning to Egypt remained dangerous. The ruler he would face represented the same system that had enslaved Israel. Moses was not traveling back to recover a former life. He was going to announce the end of Pharaoh's claim over a people Pharaoh regarded as property. Moses took Zipporah, and his sons placed them on a donkey and began the journey toward Egypt. In his hand, he carried the staff of God. The contrast was striking. He did not return with soldiers. He carried no royal document granting authority. There was no visible force capable of compelling Pharaoh. A former fugitive traveling with his family and holding a shepherd's staff was moving toward the most powerful ruler in the land. But God gave Moses a further warning. When he returned to Egypt, he was to perform before Pharaoh the wonders placed in his power. Yet Pharaoh's heart would be hardened, and the ruler would refuse to release the people. Moses was instructed to tell Pharaoh that Israel was God's firstborn son. Pharaoh was commanded to release that son so that Israel might serve God. If Pharaoh refused, judgment would reach Egypt's own firstborn. The conflict was being defined in terms deeper than economics or politics. Pharaoh believed Israel belonged to Egypt. God declared that Israel belonged to him. The question was not simply whether an enslaved population would be permitted to migrate. The question was whose authority would finally determine Israel's future. During the journey, the narrative includes a brief and difficult episode involving Moses, Zipporah, and circumcision. The passage is compact and many details remain debated. What is clear is that Moses' own household could not treat the sign of the covenant casually while he was being sent to represent the God of that covenant. Zipporah circumcised their son, and the immediate danger passed. The incident appears suddenly, but its placement carries weight. Moses was going to call Pharaoh to obedience. He himself could not approach the mission while neglecting covenant responsibility. The deliverer was not placed above the demands connected to the God he served. Meanwhile, God spoke to Aaron and told him to meet Moses in the wilderness. The brothers met at the mountain of God. Years had passed since Moses fled Egypt. Scripture does not describe their conversation in detail, but Moses told Aaron everything God had said and all the signs he had been commanded to perform. Together they traveled to Egypt. Moses had left alone as a fugitive. He returned beside his brother as a messenger. They gathered the elders of Israel. Aaron spoke the words God had given Moses, and Moses performed the signs before the people. The elders listened. The Israelites believed. When they heard that the Lord had visited them and seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. For a people who had cried out through years of oppression, the message must have carried enormous hope. God had seen. God had heard. God had not abandoned the covenant. Deliverance was coming. Yet the people did not know how fierce the resistance would become. They did not know that the first meeting with Pharaoh would make their suffering worse. They did not know that hope would soon be tested by heavier burdens, public accusations, and the apparent failure of Moses' mission. Moses himself had once asked who he was to stand before Pharaoh. Now the question was no longer theoretical. The palace he had fled stood ahead of him. The ruler of Egypt would soon hear a command from the God of an enslaved people. Moses and Aaron were prepared to enter Pharaoh's presence and declare words that challenged the foundation of Egyptian control. "Let my people go." Pharaoh would not be impressed by a shepherd's staff. He would not recognize the authority of Israel's God. And rather than releasing the Hebrews, he would tighten his grip until even the slaves began to wish Moses had never returned. Moses against Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron entered Pharaoh's presence carrying no army, no wealth, and no visible authority recognized by Egypt. They came with a message. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." The demand was direct, but its meaning was larger than a temporary journey. Pharaoh regarded the Hebrews as labor belonging to Egypt. Their bodies strengthened his economy. Their work supported his building projects. Their freedom would represent both a financial loss and a challenge to royal authority. Now 2 Hebrew brothers stood before him, declaring that a God Pharaoh did not acknowledge had claimed those slaves as his own people. Pharaoh answered with contempt. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." The conflict was now openly defined. Moses had not returned merely to negotiate better working conditions. Pharaoh was being commanded to surrender control over a population he believed belonged to him. The ruler of Egypt refused because he did not recognize the authority behind the command. Moses and Aaron explained that the God of the Hebrews had met with them. They asked to travel 3 days into the wilderness and offer sacrifices, warning that judgment could come if the people failed to worship. Pharaoh did not respond with curiosity. He accused Moses and Aaron of distracting the people from their work. The Hebrews were already numerous, he said, and now these men were encouraging them to rest from their labor. That same day, Pharaoh issued a new order to the taskmasters and Hebrew foremen. The workers would no longer be given straw for making bricks. They would have to gather it themselves, yet their daily quota would remain unchanged. Straw helped bind the clay used in brick production. Removing access to it did not make the task merely inconvenient. It forced the Hebrews to spend additional time searching for material while still being required to produce the same number of bricks. Pharaoh's command was designed to turn hope into punishment. He wanted the people to associate Moses' message with greater pain. Egyptian taskmasters drove the workers out, telling them to find their own straw. The Hebrews scattered through the land gathering stubble. When they failed to meet their quotas, the Hebrew foremen were beaten. The foreman appealed directly to Pharaoh. Why were they being treated this way? Why were they blamed when straw was no longer provided? Pharaoh accused them of laziness. Their desire to sacrifice in the wilderness, he said, proved that they had too much free time. They were ordered back to work. The foremen left Pharaoh's presence, knowing that their situation had become desperate. Outside, they encountered Moses and Aaron. Their anger was immediate. They asked the Lord to judge Moses and Aaron for making the Israelites offensive in Pharaoh's sight and placing a sword in Egypt's hand to kill them. The very people Moses had returned to deliver now blamed him for worsening their suffering. Years earlier, one Hebrew had asked who made Moses ruler and judge over them. Now a new generation was asking, in effect, why he had returned at all. The first public act of the mission appeared to have failed. Moses turned to God with words of anguish. "Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me?" Since Moses had spoken to Pharaoh, he said the ruler had done evil to Israel, and no deliverance had come. Moses' question was not the language of calm confidence. He had obeyed the call, confronted Pharaoh, and watched the burden become heavier. But God had already warned that Pharaoh would resist. The mission had not failed because Pharaoh said no. His refusal was the beginning of the confrontation through which Egypt would learn what Pharaoh claimed not to know. God told Moses that he would now see what would be done to Pharaoh. Under a mighty hand, the ruler would release Israel. Under a mighty hand, he would eventually drive them from the land. God again identified himself as the Lord and recalled the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had heard the groaning of the Israelites and remembered his promise. Then God gave Moses a message containing repeated declarations of divine action. "I am the Lord. I will bring you out. I will free you. I will redeem you. I will take you as my people. I will be your God. I will bring you into the land. I will give it to you as a possession." Deliverance would not depend on Israel overpowering Egypt. God would act. Moses carried the message to the Israelites, but they did not listen because of their broken spirit and cruel bondage. This moment reveals the depth of slavery's damage. The people had believed when Moses first performed the signs. They had bowed in worship after hearing that God had seen their affliction. But hope became harder to receive when obedience appeared to produce more suffering. Their inability to listen was not simply stubbornness, they were exhausted. A crushed spirit can make even a promise sound impossible. God again commanded Moses to go to Pharaoh and demand Israel's release. Moses objected. If his own people would not listen, why would Pharaoh? He described himself again as having difficulty speaking, yet the command remained. Moses and Aaron were to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. When they returned to Pharaoh, the ruler demanded a miraculous sign. Aaron threw down his staff and it became a serpent. But Pharaoh summoned his wise men and sorcerers. Egypt's magicians performed something similar through their secret arts. Their staffs also appeared as serpents. For a moment, it seemed that Egypt could answer the sign of Israel's God with power of its own. Then Aaron's staff swallowed their staffs. The sign did not yet persuade Pharaoh, but it announced the direction of the conflict. Egypt might imitate. It could not overcome. Pharaoh's heart remained hard, and he refused to listen. The struggle then moved beyond the palace. Moses was instructed to meet Pharaoh in the morning as the ruler went out to the Nile. Moses stood by the riverbank, holding the staff that had become a serpent. The Nile was Egypt's lifeline. Its regular flooding supported agriculture, and its waters connected settlements across the land. Egypt's prosperity depended upon it. Moses delivered the command again. "Let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness." Because Pharaoh had refused, Moses announced that the waters of the Nile would become blood. The fish would die, the river would stink, and the Egyptians would struggle to drink its water. Aaron stretched out the staff over Egypt's waters. The Nile turned to blood. Fish died. The river became foul. Water stored in containers was affected, and the Egyptians dug along the banks seeking drinkable water. The river that had once received the bodies of Hebrew infants now became a sign of judgment against the kingdom that had shed their blood. But Egypt's magicians appeared to reproduce the sign. Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He turned and went into his palace without taking the warning seriously. 7 days passed. Then Moses was sent back with the same demand. If Pharaoh continued to refuse, frogs would cover the land. They would rise from the river, enter houses, bedrooms, ovens, and kneading bowls. They would reach Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. Aaron stretched his hand over the waters, and frogs came up across Egypt. The magicians again produced frogs, but imitation could not remove the plague. Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and asked them to plead with the Lord to take the frogs away. In return, he promised to let the people go and offer sacrifices. Moses allowed Pharaoh to choose when the frogs should be removed, so that the ruler would know there was no one like the Lord. Pharaoh chose the next day. Moses prayed, and the frogs died in the houses, courtyards, and fields. The Egyptians gathered them into piles, and the land smelled of decay. But when Pharaoh saw relief, he hardened his heart and broke his promise. This pattern would repeat. Under pressure, Pharaoh would speak as if he were ready to yield. When relief came, he would resist again. The next plague arrived without another recorded warning. Aaron struck the dust of the ground, and it became swarms of small biting creatures throughout Egypt. The exact insect represented by the Hebrew word is debated and is translated in different versions as gnats, lice, or mosquitoes. Whatever their precise identity, they afflicted both people and animals. The magicians tried to reproduce the sign, but they could not. They told Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." The men who had appeared capable of matching the earlier wonders had reached their limit. Pharaoh still refused to listen. The next morning, Moses again confronted him with the same command, "Let my people go so that they may worship me." If Pharaoh refused, swarms would fill Egyptian houses and cover the ground. But this time, God would make a distinction between Egypt and the region of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. The separation would demonstrate that the plague was not a random natural disaster. The God confronting Pharaoh was present in the land and could distinguish between one people and another. Swarms entered Pharaoh's palace and the homes of his officials. The land was ruined. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and offered a compromise. The Israelites could sacrifice, but they had to remain inside Egypt. Moses refused. Israel's worship could not be controlled by Pharaoh or confined to the land of slavery. The people needed to travel into the wilderness as God had commanded. Pharaoh adjusted his offer. They could go, but not very far. Then he asked Moses to pray for him. Moses agreed to plead with the Lord, but warned Pharaoh not to act deceitfully again. The swarms were removed. Not one remained. Once relief came, Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to release the people. A new warning followed. If Pharaoh continued holding Israel, a severe disease would strike Egypt's livestock: horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats. But the livestock belonging to Israel would be spared. The plague came at the appointed time. Egyptian animals died, while Israel's livestock remained protected. Pharaoh sent officials to investigate and learned that not one of the Israelites' animals had died. The evidence did not move him. His heart remained hard. Then Moses and Aaron were instructed to take handfuls of soot from a furnace. Moses threw it into the air before Pharaoh, and it spread as fine dust over Egypt. Festering boils broke out on people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because the boils afflicted them as well. Those who had represented Egypt's spiritual and intellectual power were now physically unable to remain in the confrontation. Still, Pharaoh did not yield. The plagues were increasing in severity. Egypt's waters had been struck, its land had been invaded, its people and animals had been afflicted, its religious specialists had been exposed as powerless. But Pharaoh continued to resist, because surrender would mean admitting that his authority had limits. Before the next plague, Moses delivered a longer warning. God declared that he could have struck Pharaoh and his people so completely that they would have been wiped from the earth. But Pharaoh had been allowed to remain so that God's power might be displayed and his name proclaimed. Pharaoh's survival was not proof of victory. It was an opportunity to repent before judgment intensified. Moses announced that hail unlike anything Egypt had experienced would fall the next day. The warning also included mercy. Anyone who feared the word of the Lord could bring servants and livestock indoors. Those left in the fields would die. Some of Pharaoh's officials took the warning seriously and brought their servants and animals to shelter. Others ignored it. Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky. Thunder sounded. Hail fell. Fire flashed through the storm. The hail struck people, animals, plants, and trees across Egypt, but Goshen was spared. Flax and barley were destroyed because they were already developed, while wheat and spelt survived because they matured later. For the first time, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "This time I have sinned. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are in the wrong." The words sounded like repentance. He asked Moses to pray for the thunder and hail to stop, promising again to release Israel. Moses said that he would spread out his hands to the Lord, so Pharaoh would know that the earth belonged to him. But Moses also told the ruler that he and his officials still did not truly fear God. The storm ended. Pharaoh saw the relief and sinned again. He hardened his heart and refused to let Israel go. Confession made only to escape consequences had not transformed him. Moses returned with a warning of locusts. The insects would consume whatever the hail had left. They would fill houses in numbers unlike anything Egypt's ancestors had known. Pharaoh's officials had begun to understand what their ruler would not admit. They asked him how long Moses would be a snare to Egypt. The country was being destroyed. Why not let the men go and worship their God? Moses and Aaron were brought back. Pharaoh asked who exactly intended to leave. Moses answered that everyone would go, young and old, sons and daughters, flocks and herds, because the celebration belonged to the whole people. Pharaoh refused. He accused Moses of having evil intentions and offered another compromise: only the men could go. Then Moses and Aaron were driven from his presence. The east wind blew across Egypt, carrying locusts over the land. They covered the ground until it appeared dark. They ate every plant and fruit left after the hail. Nothing green remained. Pharaoh hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron. He confessed that he had sinned against the Lord and against them. He asked for forgiveness and pleaded that this deadly plague be removed. Moses prayed. A strong west wind carried the locusts into the Red Sea. Not one remained in Egypt. Once again, Pharaoh refused to release Israel. Then darkness fell. Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and a thick darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another, and many did not move from where they were. But the Israelites had light where they lived. The darkness was more than the absence of sunlight. In a civilization where the sun was associated with divine power and royal order, the plague exposed the inability of Egypt's religion to restore the light. Pharaoh summoned Moses and offered another compromise. The Israelites could go with their children, but their flocks and herds had to remain behind. Moses refused. The animals were necessary for sacrifice, and the people did not yet know what offerings God would require. Not one hoof could be left behind. Pharaoh's anger erupted. He ordered Moses to leave and warned him never to appear before him again. If Moses saw Pharaoh's face another time, he would die. Moses answered that Pharaoh had spoken correctly. He would not appear before him again in the same way. The confrontation had reached its final boundary. 9 plagues had struck Egypt. The Nile had failed. The land had been overwhelmed. Livestock and crops had been destroyed. Egypt's magicians had been defeated. Darkness had covered the kingdom. Yet Pharaoh still held Israel. The last plague would not strike Egypt's environment, economy, or animals. It would enter Egyptian families. Before it came, God instructed Moses to prepare Israel for departure. The people were to ask their Egyptian neighbors for silver and gold. By this point, Moses had become highly regarded among Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptian people, even though Pharaoh himself continued to resist. Moses announced the final judgment. Around midnight, every firstborn in Egypt would die, from Pharaoh's firstborn, who sat near the throne, to the firstborn of servants, prisoners, and livestock. A great cry would rise through the land unlike any before or after it. But among the Israelites, not even a dog would growl against them. The distinction between Egypt and Israel would be unmistakable. After this, Moses said Pharaoh's officials would come bow before him and beg the Israelites to leave. Then Moses departed from Pharaoh in fierce anger. The ruler who once asked who the Lord was had now seen judgment after judgment. Each plague had answered his question, yet he still would not surrender. For Israel, the final night would require more than watching Egypt suffer. Every household would have to obey precise instructions. A lamb would be killed. Its blood would be placed on the doorframe. The meal would be eaten in readiness, with sandals on their feet and staffs in their hands. Deliverance was near. But before freedom came, death would pass through the land. And the sign separating life from judgment would be blood upon the doors. Passover, Exodus, and the sea. The final night in Egypt did not begin with armies marching or palace gates collapsing. It began inside ordinary homes. Across the land of Goshen, Israelite families followed the instructions Moses had received from God. Each household selected a lamb without defect. Smaller families could share with their neighbors so that nothing would be wasted. The animal was kept until the appointed day, then killed at twilight. Its blood was collected and placed on the 2 doorposts and the upper beam of each house. The sign was visible from outside. Inside, the families roasted the lamb over fire and ate it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The bitter herbs reflected the bitterness of slavery. The unleavened bread was prepared without waiting for dough to rise, because departure would come suddenly. They ate dressed for travel. Belts fastened, sandals on their feet, staffs in their hands. This was not a relaxed meal at the end of an ordinary day. It was a meal eaten while waiting for the command to move. God told Israel that this night would become a memorial. Future generations would remember it as the Passover of the Lord. The name came from the promise connected to the blood. When judgment passed through Egypt, God would see the blood and pass over the marked houses. The plague that struck the firstborn would not destroy those sheltered behind the appointed sign. The blood was not evidence that the Israelites were naturally better than the Egyptians. They too needed protection. Deliverance required trust, expressed through obedience. At midnight, the judgment came. The firstborn died throughout Egypt, from the heir in Pharaoh's palace to the firstborn of prisoners and servants. The loss also reached the firstborn among the livestock. No level of wealth status or power created immunity. The palace was struck. The homes of officials were struck. The houses of ordinary Egyptians were struck. A great cry rose during the night because there was death in every household. The ruler who had ordered Hebrew sons to die now faced death inside his own house. For years, Pharaoh had treated Israelite families as resources beneath his control. He had attempted to weaken the nation by taking its sons. He had increased labor when they asked to worship. He had repeatedly promised release, then withdrawn his word when danger passed. Now there was no relief to bargain for. The final plague did not merely interrupt Egypt's life, it entered the line of succession and struck the future of the kingdom. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. He told them to rise, leave his people, and go worship the Lord as they had requested. They could take their children, flocks, and herds. Then Pharaoh added a final request. "Bless me also." The ruler who had once asked who the Lord was, now asked the servants of the Lord for a blessing. But even this request came after irreversible loss. Throughout Egypt, people urged the Israelites to leave quickly. They feared that if the Hebrews remained, more death would follow. The same population once held by force was now being pushed toward freedom. Israel prepared to move. The people carried dough before it had been leavened, wrapping their kneading bowls in clothing and placing them on their shoulders. They asked their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver, gold, and clothing, as Moses had instructed. The Egyptians gave them what they requested. This was not a secret escape by a defeated people carrying nothing. The enslaved population departed with goods from the nation that had exploited its labor. The text presents this as Egypt being stripped of wealth. Generations of forced service had enriched the kingdom. Now the former slaves left with resources that would support them on the journey and later contribute to Israel's worship. They traveled from Ramses towards Succoth. The biblical account describes a vast company of Israelites together with many others who went with them and large numbers of livestock. The precise population figures and how they should be understood remain subjects of discussion, but the narrative's central point is unmistakable. This was not the escape of one family. A people was leaving Egypt. They had entered the land generations earlier as the household of Jacob. They were now departing as the tribes of Israel. The night of Passover marked a new beginning in their national memory. God instructed them to regard the month of their deliverance as the first month of their religious calendar. Their understanding of time would now be shaped by redemption. Israel was also commanded to remember the departure through the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For 7 days, leaven was to be removed, and future children were to be taught why the practice mattered. The story could not be allowed to disappear when the generation that experienced it died. Parents would tell their sons and daughters that these customs were observed because of what the Lord had done when He brought Israel out of Egypt. The deliverance of one generation was to become the identity of those who followed. Moses also instructed the people concerning their firstborn. Because Israel's firstborn had been spared during the final plague, they belonged to God in a special way. Firstborn animals were to be set apart, and firstborn sons were to be redeemed. Again, children would ask what the practice meant. The answer would return to Egypt. With a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of slavery. The Exodus was not meant to remain only a dramatic memory. It would shape worship, family instruction, law, and Israel's understanding of who they were. God did not lead the people by the shortest route toward Canaan. A direct path through Philistine territory might have appeared more efficient, but it could quickly bring Israel into military conflict. God declared that if the people faced war too soon, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. They had left slavery physically. Their thinking had not yet been transformed. They were not an organized army prepared to conquer territory. They were families carrying possessions, livestock, children, and the habits formed under generations of oppression. Freedom could be granted in one night. Learning to live as a free people would take far longer. So God led Israel toward the wilderness and the sea. Moses also carried the bones of Joseph. Before his death, generations earlier, Joseph had expressed confidence that God would visit Israel and bring them out of Egypt. He had made the descendants of Israel swear that when they departed, they would carry his remains with them. Now that promise was being fulfilled. Joseph's bones became a silent witness within the moving nation. Egypt had not been Israel's final home. The God who had once brought Jacob's family into Egypt for survival was now bringing their descendants out according to the covenant promise. Israel traveled from Sukkoth and camped at Etham near the edge of the wilderness. They were not left to navigate alone. By day the Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud to guide their path. By night he appeared in a pillar of fire, giving them light so they could travel. The cloud and fire represented guidance, protection, and divine presence. The God who had spoken from fire to Moses was now leading the entire nation. But the path soon appeared to make no sense. God instructed Moses to turn back and camp near the sea. From a military perspective, their position would seem vulnerable. Pharaoh would conclude that the Israelites were wandering in confusion and had become trapped by the wilderness. This was not an accidental mistake in navigation. The route would draw Egypt into one final confrontation. When news reached Pharaoh that the people had fled, he and his officials reconsidered what they had done. Why have we let Israel go and lost their labor? Grief had forced Pharaoh to release the slaves, but grief had not produced lasting submission. Once the immediate terror of the final plague had passed, the economic and political consequences became impossible for him to accept. He ordered his chariot prepared. Pharaoh gathered 600 of Egypt's finest chariots, along with other chariots and officers, and pursued Israel. Chariots represented speed training and military superiority. Against families traveling on foot, Egypt's forces appeared overwhelming. The former slaves had no comparable weapon. No fortified city protected them. No allied nation stood ready to intervene. As Pharaoh's army approached, the Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptians advancing. Fear spread through the camp. The people cried out to God, but they also turned against Moses. They asked whether he had brought them into the wilderness to die because there were no graves in Egypt. Why had he done this to them? Had they not told him to leave them alone and allow them to serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. The accusation revealed how quickly fear could reinterpret the past. Egypt had been a place of forced labor, beatings, murdered children, and systematic oppression. But with an army approaching and the sea blocking escape, slavery began to look safer than freedom. Fear made bondage seem reasonable. The people had witnessed the plagues. They had survived the Passover night. They had left carrying Egypt's wealth. They had followed the pillar of cloud and fire. Yet one sight, the approaching chariots, was enough to make them believe that the entire deliverance had led only to death. Moses answered the people with words that would define this moment. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today." The Egyptians they saw would not remain a threat forever. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Israel could not defeat Pharaoh's army. This rescue would not be explained as a military victory achieved through superior Hebrew strategy. The same God who had broken Egypt's grip through the plagues would now act at the sea. But stillness did not mean permanent inactivity. God asked Moses why he was crying out and commanded the Israelites to move forward. Moses was to lift his staff and stretch out his hand over the sea so the waters would divide. Israel would cross through on dry ground. The Egyptians would follow. Their pursuit would lead them into the place where God's power would be displayed over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then Egypt would know that he was the Lord. The angel of God who had been traveling before Israel moved behind them. The pillar of cloud also shifted from the front of the camp to the rear, coming between Israel and the Egyptian army. On one side, the cloud brought darkness. On the other, it gave light. Throughout the night, the two camps were kept apart. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. A strong east wind blew all night, driving back the waters and turning the seabed into dry ground. The waters divided. The Israelites went into the sea with walls of water on their right and left. The moment required movement. Families stepped onto ground that had been hidden beneath the water. Parents carried children. Animals were driven forward. Possessions gathered in haste were taken through the opening. Behind them stood Egypt. Ahead lay a passage no human power had created. The nation moved between the waters while the divine presence guarded its rear. Pharaoh's forces followed. The horse chariots and horsemen entered the sea after Israel. The ruler who could not tolerate the loss of his slaves pursued them into a path opened by the God he had resisted. During the final watch of the night, the Lord looked down upon the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw them into confusion. The wheels of their chariots became difficult to move. The military technology that had made Egypt terrifying now became a burden inside the sea. The Egyptians recognized that the battle had turned against them. They cried out that they must flee because the Lord was fighting for Israel against Egypt. It was the conclusion Pharaoh should have accepted before the Nile became blood. His soldiers understood it only after entering the divided waters. Then God commanded Moses to stretch out his hand once more. The sea returned to its normal course as morning approached. The Egyptians tried to flee, but the waters closed over the chariots, horsemen, and army. The force sent to drag Israel back into bondage was overwhelmed. The text declares that not one of them remained. The Israelites had crossed on dry ground. When morning came, they stood on the opposite shore and saw the evidence of Egypt's defeat. The enemy that had appeared certain to destroy them could no longer pursue. Israel saw the great power the Lord had used against Egypt. The people feared the Lord and believed in him and in Moses, his servant. The man once rejected with the question, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" now stood as the recognized leader of a delivered nation. Yet the victory did not belong to Moses. He had raised the staff. God had opened the sea. Moses and the Israelites sang, "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." The song celebrated God as Israel's strength, salvation, and warrior. It recalled the defeat of Pharaoh's forces and looked beyond the sea toward the land God had promised. Miriam identified as a prophetess, and the sister of Aaron took a tambourine. The women followed her with tambourines and dancing. She answered the song with the same central declaration, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously." Miriam had once stood near the Nile, watching over a basket that carried her infant brother. Now she stood beside a sea through which that brother had led an entire nation. The child rescued from Pharaoh's decree had become the servant through whom Pharaoh's power was broken. The Exodus appeared complete. Israel was outside Egypt. Pharaoh's army was gone. The people had sung the first great song of their freedom. But the opposite shore was not the promised land. It was the wilderness. The sea had removed the army behind them, but it had not removed fear, impatience, or the instincts formed during slavery. The people had seen God turn water into blood and divide water into walls. Soon they would enter a region where they could find no water fit to drink. The nation had learned that God could defeat Pharaoh. Now it would have to learn whether it could trust him for bread, water, order, law, and life itself. Egypt no longer held Israel, but Egypt still lived within many of the people who had escaped it. And before they could become a covenant nation, the wilderness would reveal what freedom alone had not changed. Sinai, the covenant, and the golden calf. Israel had crossed the sea, but the wilderness immediately began asking a harder question. Could the people trust the God who had delivered them when no visible enemy was present and no obvious supply remained? At the sea, the danger had been clear. Pharaoh's chariots were behind them and the waters were before them. God acted with unmistakable power. In the wilderness, the threats were quieter. Thirst, hunger, uncertainty, daily dependence. These would reveal what the plagues in the divided sea had not yet changed within the people. Moses led Israel away from the Red Sea into the wilderness of Shur. For 3 days they traveled without finding water. The celebration at the shore gave way to exhaustion. When the people finally reached Marah, they found water, but it was too bitter to drink. The place itself received a name associated with bitterness. The people complained against Moses. "What shall we drink?" Their question was understandable. A large traveling population could not survive without water. But their complaint also showed how quickly the memory of deliverance could be pushed aside by the urgency of the present moment. Moses cried out to God. God showed him a piece of wood, and when Moses threw it into the water became fit to drink. There Israel was tested and given instruction concerning obedience. The God who had judged Egypt also revealed himself as the one who healed and sustained his people. Soon afterward, the nation reached Elim, where they found 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. The contrast was immediate. Marah had seemed to prove that the wilderness held nothing but bitterness. Elim revealed that provision could already be waiting beyond the place of disappointment. But the journey continued. About a month after leaving Egypt, Israel entered the wilderness of Sin between Elim and Sinai. Food supplies began to run low, and the entire community complained against Moses and Aaron. They remembered Egypt selectively. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt," they said, "where we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted." The memory ignored forced labor, beatings, murdered children, and the desperate cries that had risen to God. Fear reshaped slavery into security. The people accused Moses and Aaron of bringing them into the wilderness to starve. Moses understood that although the complaints were directed toward human leaders, their deeper accusation was against God. The people were questioning whether the one who brought them out was able or willing to keep them alive. God answered by promising bread from heaven. Each morning, a fine, flaky substance appeared on the ground after the dew lifted. When the Israelites saw it, they asked, "What is it?" That question was reflected in the name manna. Moses told them that it was the bread the Lord had given them to eat. Each household was to gather enough for the day. Those who gathered much did not have too much, and those who gathered little did not have too little. The provision was sufficient for each person's need. But it came with a test. The people were not to store ordinary portions until the next morning. Some ignored the instruction. The leftover manna filled with worms and smelled. Daily bread required daily trust. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much because the 7th day was to be a Sabbath of rest. Unlike the food stored on other days, the portion prepared for the Sabbath did not spoil. Again, some people disregarded the command and went out to gather on the 7th day. They found nothing. The wilderness was teaching Israel that freedom did not mean life without authority. They had been released from Pharaoh's commands in order to learn obedience to God. For 40 years, manna would remain part of Israel's daily life, continuing until the people reached the land of Canaan. Every morning carried the same lesson. Their survival did not ultimately come from Egypt's stored wealth or their own ability to control the future. They lived because provision came. From the wilderness of sin, Israel moved from place to place as God directed and camped at Rephidim. Once again, there was no water. The people quarreled with Moses, "Give us water to drink." Moses asked why they were testing the Lord, but the people's anger increased. They accused him of bringing them their children and their livestock out of Egypt to die of thirst. Moses cried out to God, saying that the people were almost ready to stone him. God instructed Moses to take some of Israel's elders and the staff with which he had struck the Nile. Moses was to go to a rock at Horeb, where God would stand before him. He struck the rock. Water came out, and the people drank. Moses named the place Massah and Meribah, names associated with testing and quarreling, because the Israelites had asked whether the Lord was truly among them. The water answered the immediate need, but the question would return repeatedly. Was God with them only when miracles were visible? Could he be trusted when the next crisis appeared at Rephidim? Israel also faced its first major military attack after leaving Egypt. The Amalekites came and fought against them. Moses told Joshua to choose men and go out to battle. This is the first biblical appearance of Joshua the man who would eventually succeed Moses. While Joshua led the fighters below, Moses climbed a hill with the staff of God in his hand. Aaron and Hur went with him. As long as Moses held up his hands, Israel gained the advantage. When his hands grew tired and fell, Amalek began to prevail. Moses could not sustain the posture alone. Aaron and Hur placed a stone beneath him, and Moses sat while they supported his hands, one on each side, until sunset. Joshua defeated the Amalekite forces. The victory involved warriors in the valley, Moses on the hill, and companions who supported him when his strength failed. Israel's leader had once attempted to confront injustice alone by killing an Egyptian. Now leadership looked different. Moses depended on Joshua. He depended on Aaron and Hur. He depended completely on God. The battle was remembered by building an altar, and the conflict with Amalek would continue into later generations. Soon afterward, Jethro heard what God had done for Moses and Israel. He came to the wilderness, bringing Zipporah and Moses' sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and welcomed him. He told Jethro how God had delivered Israel from Pharaoh and sustained the people through hardship. Jethro rejoiced and declared that the Lord was greater than all gods. He offered sacrifices, and Israel's elders shared a meal before God. The next day, Jethro watched Moses sit from morning until evening, judging disputes among the people. Individuals stood in long lines waiting for Moses to decide their cases, and explain God's instructions. Jethro saw that the system could not continue. "What you are doing is not good," he warned. "Moses would wear himself out, and the people would suffer with him." The burden was too heavy for one person. Jethro advised him to teach the people God's laws, while appointing capable, trustworthy men to judge ordinary disputes. The most difficult cases could still be brought to Moses. Moses listened. He selected leaders over groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. This reorganization was more than an administrative improvement. Israel was becoming a community that required justice, responsibility, and shared leadership. Moses would remain the central mediator, but he was not meant to control every decision personally. In the 3rd month after leaving Egypt, Israel entered the wilderness of Sinai and camped before the mountain. Moses went up to God. The Lord told him to remind the people what they had seen in Egypt and how he had carried them as if on eagle's wings and brought them to himself. Deliverance had a destination deeper than geography. God had not merely brought Israel away from Pharaoh, he had brought them to himself. If Israel obeyed the covenant, they would be God's treasured possession among all nations. Although the whole earth belonged to him, Israel would have a particular calling as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A priest stands in service before God and represents sacred truth to others. Israel's calling was therefore not merely privilege, it was responsibility. Moses gathered the elders and placed the words before them. The people answered together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." Moses carried their response back to God. The nation was instructed to prepare for God's appearance. They were to consecrate themselves, wash their garments, and remain within established boundaries around the mountain. No one was to treat the mountain casually or rush into the divine presence. On the 3rd morning, thunder and lightning covered Sinai. A thick cloud rested on the mountain, and the sound of a trumpet grew increasingly loud. The people trembled. Moses brought them out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. The mountain shook violently. The wilderness where Moses had once stood alone before a burning bush now burned before an entire nation. God spoke the words of the covenant. Israel was reminded first of who had acted for them. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." The commandments began with deliverance. Israel was not told to earn rescue through obedience. The people had already been rescued. The law would now teach them how a redeemed community was to live. They were to have no other gods. They were not to make idols or worship created images as divine. They were not to misuse God's name. They were to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. They were to honor father and mother. They were not to murder, commit adultery, steal, give false testimony, or covet what belonged to another. The commandments addressed worship time, family life, marriage, property, truth, and desire. They did not merely regulate public behavior, they reached toward the loyalties and intentions beneath behavior. The people saw the lightning, heard the trumpet, and watched the smoking mountain. Afraid, they stood at a distance and asked Moses to speak to them himself. They feared that if God continued speaking directly, they would die. Moses told them not to be afraid in the sense of fleeing from God, but explained that the encounter was intended to produce a reverent fear that would restrain them from sin. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Further laws were then given concerning worship servants, personal injury, property, justice, social responsibility, festivals, and the treatment of vulnerable people. Israel was warned not to mistreat foreigners, widows, or orphans. The people knew what it meant to live as foreigners under oppression. They were not to reproduce Egypt's cruelty once they possessed power of their own. Judges were forbidden to accept bribes or distort justice. The poor were not to be denied fairness. The land itself would receive rhythms of rest. Worship and justice could not be separated. A nation claiming loyalty to God could not ignore how its courts, households, and economy treated human beings. Moses wrote down the words of the Lord. An altar was built at the foot of the mountain, along with 12 pillars representing Israel's tribes. Young men offered sacrifices. Moses took part of the blood and placed it on the altar. He read the book of the covenant aloud to the people. Again they answered, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Moses then sprinkled blood upon the people and declared it to be the blood of the covenant God had made with them. The covenant joined promise with obligation. Israel belonged to God. God would dwell among them. The people were called to respond with loyalty. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders went partway up the mountain. There they experienced a vision of Israel's God. Beneath his feet appeared something like pavement made of sapphire, as clear as the sky. The text does not attempt to describe God's full form. It emphasizes both his glory and the extraordinary mercy that allowed Israel's representatives to remain alive in his presence. They saw God, and they ate and drank. The covenant was confirmed with a meal. Then Moses was called higher. He entered the cloud and remained on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. There God gave instructions concerning the sanctuary, priesthood, sacrifices, sacred furniture, and the service through which Israel's worship would be ordered. At the center of these instructions was a promise. "Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them." The God who appeared in fire did not intend to remain distant on a mountain. His presence would travel with the people. The tabernacle would be a portable sanctuary constructed according to a revealed pattern. It would include an outer court, a holy place, and an innermost area known as the Most Holy Place. Inside would stand the Ark of the Covenant, a gold-covered chest associated with God's throne and the testimony of the covenant. The tabernacle would also contain a table for sacred bread, a golden lampstand, and altars connected to sacrifice and incense. Aaron and his sons would serve as priests, wearing garments that represented the dignity and responsibility of their office. Sacrifices would address worship, thanksgiving, purification, guilt, and the serious reality of sin. Every detail communicated the same tension. God desired to dwell among Israel, but a holy God could not be approached carelessly by a sinful people. While Moses received these instructions, the people below grew impatient. They saw the cloud, they saw the mountain, but Moses did not return. 40 days felt like abandonment. The people gathered around Aaron and demanded that he make gods who would go before them. "As for this Moses who brought us up out of Egypt," they said, "we do not know what has happened to him." Their words reduced the Exodus to Moses' work, even though they had witnessed judgment pass over the sea, manna, water, cloud, and fire. When the visible leader disappeared, they sought a visible God. Aaron told them to remove the gold earrings worn by their wives, sons, and daughters. He received the gold, shaped it, and made a calf. The people declared, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." The gold Egypt had given them was transformed into an idol resembling the worship they had known in the world of slavery. Aaron built an altar before it and announced a festival. The people offered sacrifices, ate, drank, and rose to celebrate in a way the text connects with disorder and corruption. They had promised to obey the covenant. Before Moses even descended with the stone tablets, they violated its opening commands. On the mountain, God told Moses what had happened. The people had quickly turned aside. God described them as stiff-necked, a people resisting direction like an animal refusing the guiding hand. Judgment was announced. God told Moses to stand aside so that his anger might burn against the nation. Moses himself could become the beginning of another great people. This was a defining moment for Moses. He had often suffered because of Israel. They had questioned him, blamed him, and threatened him. Now he was offered a future that did not require them. But Moses interceded. He appealed to God's reputation among the Egyptians. What would Egypt say if the people were brought out only to be destroyed in the mountains? He appealed to the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He asked God to turn from the announced destruction. The Lord relented from the total disaster he had said he would bring. Moses descended carrying 2 stone tablets written by God. Joshua, who had waited below, heard the noise from the camp and thought it sounded like battle. Moses recognized that it was not the sound of victory or defeat. It was singing. When he approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned. He threw the tablets from his hands, breaking them at the foot of the mountain. The shattered stones visibly represented the covenant Israel had already broken. Moses took the calf, burned it, ground it into powder, scattered it on water, and made the Israelites drink it. The idol presented as a god was reduced to dust. Moses confronted Aaron. "What did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin?" Aaron attempted to shift responsibility. He reminded Moses that the people were inclined toward evil. He said they had given him gold, he had thrown it into the fire, and somehow the calf had emerged. The excuse hid his active role in shaping the idol and building its altar. Moses saw that the people had become uncontrolled and exposed to shame before their enemies. He stood at the entrance to the camp and called for those who were loyal to the Lord to come to him. The Levites gathered around him. Severe judgment followed within the camp, and about 3,000 men died. The next day, Moses told the people that they had committed a great sin. He would return to God and seek atonement for them. Moses went back and confessed the people's guilt. Then he made an extraordinary request. If God would not forgive them, Moses asked that his own name be removed from the book God had written. Moses could not personally erase Israel's guilt, and God declared that those who sinned would remain responsible for their sin. Yet Moses' willingness to identify himself with the people revealed how deeply his role had changed. The man who once acted impulsively by killing one Egyptian now stood between an entire nation and judgment, pleading for mercy without denying the seriousness of its rebellion. A plague struck the people because of the calf. God then instructed Israel to continue toward the promised land, but announced that his direct presence would not go among them in the same way, because their stubbornness could lead to their destruction. The people mourned. The possibility of reaching the land without God's presence revealed the emptiness of success without relationship. Moses insisted that Israel could not continue unless God went with them. "How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us?" The presence of God was what distinguished Israel from every other nation. Land alone was not enough. Military victory was not enough. A future without God's presence was not the promise Moses sought. God answered that his presence would go with Moses and give him rest. Moses then asked, "Show me your glory." God promised to make his goodness pass before him, but explained that no human could see his full face and live. Moses was placed in a cleft of the rock and protected as God's glory passed by. Then Moses prepared 2 new stone tablets and climbed Sinai again. God proclaimed his name and character compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love and truth, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet not treating guilt as though it did not matter. Mercy and justice were held together. The covenant was renewed. Moses remained on the mountain another 40 days and nights. When he descended with the new tablets, his face shone because he had spoken with God. The Israelites were afraid to approach him. Moses called them near, delivered the commands, and afterward covered his face with a veil, except when entering God's presence. The broken covenant had not been ignored. It had been renewed through judgment, intercession, forgiveness, and divine faithfulness. Israel then began constructing the tabernacle. The people brought gold, silver, bronze, fabrics, skins, wood, oil, spices, and precious stones. They gave so freely that the craftsmen eventually told Moses there was more than enough, and the people had to be restrained from bringing additional gifts. Skilled workers, including Bezalel and Oholiab, carried out the work. The gold once used to make an idol was now offered for a sanctuary built according to God's command. The people who had used their hands in forced labor for Pharaoh now used their skills to create a place of worship. The ark was made, the lampstand was formed. The altar's curtains, frames, coverings, priestly garments, and sacred objects were completed. Moses inspected the work and saw that everything had been made as the Lord commanded. He blessed the people. On the appointed day, the tabernacle was raised. The ark was placed inside. The sacred furniture was arranged. The altar and basin were positioned. The priests were washed and clothed for service. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter because the glory rested upon it. The God who had appeared in the burning bush now dwelt symbolically at the center of Israel's camp. Whenever the cloud lifted, the people traveled. When the cloud remained, they stayed. By day the cloud was visible over the tabernacle. By night, fire appeared within it. Israel had been freed from Egypt. It had received bread from heaven, water from rock, victory in battle, commandments from Sinai, and mercy after rebellion. A sanctuary now stood among the tribes, but the presence of the tabernacle did not mean the people had learned to trust. The next stage of the journey would bring them to the border of Canaan. They would see the land promised to Abraham. They would hold its fruit in their hands. And then, after everything they had witnessed, an entire generation would decide that Egypt was stronger in memory and Canaan was too dangerous to enter. If this journey is helping you understand how the events of Exodus connect, save this documentary so you can return to the timeline later. Subscribe to continue exploring the Bible as one connected story rather than a collection of isolated scenes. Israel had survived the golden calf because Moses interceded and God showed mercy. But at the edge of the promised land, the people would face a test that could not be blamed on hunger, thirst, or the absence of evidence. They would have to choose whether the God who defeated Egypt was also able to overcome the giants ahead. And their answer would sentence a generation to die in the wilderness. The promised land refused. The cloud lifted from above the tabernacle. After nearly a year at Sinai, Israel prepared to move. The mountain had become the place where the nation received the covenant, built the tabernacle, established the priesthood, and learned how the tribes were to camp around God's presence. But Sinai was never meant to become their permanent home. The promise still lay ahead. The land of Canaan waited beyond the wilderness. Trumpets were made to summon the community, organize the tribes, and signal movement. When the cloud rose, the priests carried the ark, the tabernacle was taken down, and each tribe departed in its assigned order. What had once been a disorganized population escaping Egypt now moved as a structured nation. At the center of the camp was the sanctuary. Around it served the Levites. Beyond them stood the 12 tribes. The arrangement communicated that Israel's life was to be organized around the presence of God. Moses invited Hobab, a Midianite relative, to travel with them and share in the good God had promised Israel. Moses also valued his knowledge of the wilderness and believed he could help the people recognize suitable places to camp. The nation began its journey from the mountain of the Lord. When the ark moved, Moses said, "Rise up, Lord, may your enemies be scattered." When it rested, he said, "Return, Lord, to the countless thousands of Israel." The journey appeared ready to advance toward fulfillment, but only a short distance from Sinai, the people began to complain. The text does not initially identify the exact subject of their complaint. It simply states that their words displeased God. Fire burned at the outskirts of the camp until Moses prayed and the judgment stopped. The place was named Tabernacle, meaning burning. The warning was immediate. The people were no longer standing at the edge of Egypt. They had received the covenant and witnessed God's presence. Greater revelation brought greater responsibility. Still, dissatisfaction continued. A mixed group traveling with Israel developed an intense craving for other food, and the Israelites began weeping again. "Who will give us meat to eat?" They remembered fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic from Egypt. But they complained that now they saw nothing except manna. The food that had sustained them faithfully was treated as evidence of deprivation. Their memory of Egypt once again separated food from slavery. They remembered the taste. They forgot the chains. The manna appeared with the dew, and the people gathered ground or crushed it before cooking it. Scripture describes its appearance and taste, but the people no longer saw it as provision. Familiar mercy had become invisible to them. Moses heard families weeping at the entrances of their tents. The burden of leadership pressed upon him until he spoke to God with unusual exhaustion. Why had this responsibility been placed upon him? Had he conceived this nation, or given birth to it, that he should carry it as a nurse carries a child? Where could he find meat for everyone? Moses declared that he could not bear the people alone. The load was too heavy. His words were not the confident statements spoken beside the Red Sea. They came from a leader reaching the limits of his emotional strength. God did not condemn Moses for admitting the burden. Instead, he instructed him to gather 70 elders, recognized as leaders among Israel. God would place upon them some of the Spirit resting upon Moses, so that they could help carry responsibility. Once again, the mission expanded beyond one man. The elders gathered around the tent of meeting, and the Spirit rested upon them. They prophesied as a visible sign that they had been appointed to share in leadership. 2 men, Eldad and Medad, remained in the camp, yet the Spirit also rested upon them. A young man ran to tell Moses, and Joshua urged him to stop them. Moses answered, "Are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them." Moses did not treat spiritual authority as something he needed to protect for his own status. The burden had nearly crushed him. He welcomed others being empowered to serve. God also promised that the people would receive meat not for one day, but until it became repulsive to them. Their craving had become a rejection of the God who lived among them and a denial of the deliverance from Egypt. Moses struggled to understand how enough meat could be provided for the entire population. Would all the flocks and herds be slaughtered? Could the fish of the sea be gathered? God answered with a question. Is the Lord's arm too short? A wind drove quail from the sea and brought them around the camp in enormous numbers. The people gathered birds throughout the day-night and following day. But while the meat was still between their teeth, judgment struck. A severe plague broke out among them. The place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, the graves of craving, because there the people buried those consumed by their uncontrolled desire. The problem was not that hunger itself was sinful. God had responded to genuine needs before. The deeper issue was that Israel repeatedly interpreted dependence as abandonment. Every limitation became an accusation that Egypt had been better, and that God's deliverance could not be trusted. From there, Israel traveled to Hazeroth. Another challenge emerged, but this time it came from inside Moses' own family. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. They also questioned his unique position. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not also spoken through us? Miriam was a prophetess. Aaron was the high priest. Both held genuine roles within Israel. But legitimate service became the basis for comparison and rivalry. The issue was not whether God had ever spoken through them. He had. The issue was their attempt to use their own calling to undermine Moses' appointed responsibility. The Lord summoned Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of meeting. God explained that he often revealed himself to prophets through visions and dreams, but Moses occupied an unusual position. He was entrusted with God's household and spoke with God in an exceptionally direct manner. Why then had Miriam and Aaron not been afraid to speak against him when the cloud lifted? Miriam's skin was suddenly diseased. Aaron immediately acknowledged their foolishness and begged Moses not to let her remain under the condition. Moses cried out, "O God, please heal her." Even when challenged by his own family, he interceded. Miriam remained outside the camp for 7 days before being restored. The entire nation waited for her. Then Israel continued toward the wilderness of Paran. The promised land was now near. From the wilderness, God instructed Moses to send men to explore Canaan. One leader was selected from each tribe. Among them were Caleb from Judah and Hoshea from Ephraim, whom Moses called Joshua. Moses told the spies to examine the land. Was it good or bad? Were the inhabitants strong or weak? Were the cities fortified or unprotected? Was the soil fertile? Were there trees? They were also encouraged to bring back some of the land's fruit. The spies entered Canaan and traveled through it for 40 days. They saw cities, fields, valleys, and established populations. In the valley of Eshcol, they cut a cluster of grapes so large that 2 men carried it on a pole. They also brought pomegranates and figs. When they returned to the camp, the fruit stood as visible evidence. The land was real. The promise was not an imaginary destination beyond the wilderness. The spies reported that the land flowed with milk and honey, language describing abundance and fertility. Then came the word that changed the atmosphere. However, the people living there were powerful. The cities were fortified and very large. The descendants of Anak were there, people associated with unusual size and feared as formidable warriors. The spies listed the nations occupying the region. Amalekites lived in the south. Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites lived in the hill country. Canaanites lived near the sea and along the Jordan. The report was not false. Canaan was inhabited. Its cities were defended. Entering would require conflict. Caleb quieted the people. "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." Caleb did not deny the obstacles. He interpreted them in light of what God had already done. The other spies responded that Israel could not attack the inhabitants because they were stronger. Their report grew darker as it spread through the camp. They described the land as one that devoured those living in it. They said the people were of great size and that they themselves felt like grasshoppers by comparison. Fear transformed a military challenge into an impossible world. The spies began by describing fortified cities. They ended by describing themselves as insects. That night, the entire community raised its voice and wept. The people complained against Moses and Aaron. "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why had the Lord brought them into the land only to die by the sword?" Their wives and children would become plunder. Then they proposed the final rejection of the Exodus. "Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" they said to one another. "We should choose a leader and go back." This was more than fear of battle. It was a decision to reverse the journey of deliverance. Israel had crossed the sea, received manna, drunk water from the rock, stood before Sinai, entered covenant, built the tabernacle, and seen God's glory descend. Now, with the fruit of Canaan before them, they wanted another leader who would take them back to slavery. Moses and Aaron fell face down before the assembly. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes. They pleaded with the people not to rebel. The land was exceedingly good. If God was pleased with Israel, he would bring them into it. The people of Canaan should not be feared because their protection was gone while the Lord was with Israel. Do not be afraid of them. But the community talked about stoning Joshua and Caleb. The conflict had reached its breaking point. The people were prepared to kill the men who called them to trust God. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting before all Israel. God asked Moses how long the people would treat him with contempt. How long would they refuse to believe, despite all the signs performed among them? Judgment was announced. God could strike the nation and begin again, with Moses making from him a people greater and stronger than Israel. This was not the first time Moses had heard such an offer. After the golden calf, he had stood between Israel and destruction. Now he interceded again. He appealed to what Egypt had witnessed. The Egyptians knew that God had brought Israel out and that his presence traveled among them. If Israel were destroyed in the wilderness, the nations might claim that God had been unable to bring them into the land he promised. Moses then appealed to the character God had revealed at Sinai. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Moses asked for pardon according to the greatness of God's faithful love. God answered that he had forgiven the people as Moses requested. The nation would not be completely destroyed. But forgiveness did not erase every consequence. The generation that had repeatedly tested God and refused to trust him would not enter Canaan. The adults counted among Israel's fighting men would die in the wilderness. Their children, whom they claimed would become plunder, would be brought into the land. Caleb would enter because he possessed a different spirit and followed God wholeheartedly. Joshua would enter as well. The 10 spies who spread the faithless report died by plague. Israel's 40 days of exploration would be reflected in 40 years of wandering, 1 year for each day, until the rebellious generation had passed away. The distance between the people and the promise was no longer measured mainly in miles. It would be measured in funerals. Moses told Israel what God had declared. The people mourned bitterly. The next morning they rose early and decided to go into the hill country after all. "We have sinned," they said. "We will go up to the place the Lord promised." But repentance cannot be reduced to changing direction after consequences are announced. God had now commanded them to turn back toward the wilderness. Moses warned them not to advance. The Lord would not be with them in this attempt, and their enemies would defeat them. The people went anyway. They had refused to enter when God commanded them. Now they tried to enter when God commanded them not to. The ark remained in the camp. Moses did not go with them. The Amalekites and Canaanites came down and attacked, driving them back. Presumption failed where faith had refused to move. Israel turned toward the wilderness. The generation rescued from Egypt would not become the generation that occupied Canaan. Yet, even after judgment, God continued giving instructions for the future. Laws concerning sacrifices were given for the time when Israel would eventually enter the land. The wording itself carried hope. "When you enter the land I am giving you." The promise had not been canceled. Its fulfillment would pass to the children. God's covenant faithfulness survived the unbelief of the generation that first approached Canaan. But the years ahead would not be peaceful. The judgment at Kadesh did not remove ambition, jealousy, or resistance to Moses' leadership. A Levite named Korah joined with Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben, along with 250 respected leaders of the community. They gathered against Moses and Aaron. Their accusations sounded spiritual. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly? It was true that Israel had been called a holy nation, but Korah used a true statement to support a false claim. The holiness of the community did not erase the distinct responsibilities God had assigned. Korah and his fellow Levites already possessed a privileged role in serving around the tabernacle, but they sought the priesthood as well. Moses fell face down. He declared that God would reveal whom he had chosen. Korah and his followers were instructed to bring censers with burning incense before the Lord. Aaron would do the same. The test would show who had authority to approach in priestly service. Moses also summoned Dathan and Abiram. They refused to come. Their words revealed how completely they had reversed the story of deliverance. They accused Moses of bringing them out of a land flowing with milk and honey, using the description of Canaan to describe Egypt, only to kill them in the wilderness. Egypt had become the promised land in their retelling. Moses had become the oppressor. They accused him of failing to provide fields and vineyards and declared that they would not submit. The next day, Korah assembled the community at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord appeared. Moses warned the people to move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and touch nothing belonging to them. The earth opened beneath the rebels, and their households disappeared into the ground. Fire consumed the 250 men offering incense. The censers were collected and hammered into a covering for the altar, becoming a lasting warning that unauthorized persons were not to claim the priesthood for themselves. But even after this judgment, the community accused Moses and Aaron of killing the Lord's people. A plague began spreading through the camp. Moses immediately told Aaron to take his censer, place fire and incense in it, and make atonement for the people. Aaron ran into the middle of the assembly. He stood between the dead and the living. The plague stopped. The man accused of seeking power risked himself to intercede for those accusing him. Still, the crisis of authority required a visible resolution. A staff was collected from the leader of each tribe, with Aaron's name written on Levi's staff. The staffs were placed before the covenant testimony. By the next day, Aaron's staff had sprouted. It produced buds, blossoms, and ripe almonds. Dead wood had come to life. The sign confirmed that Aaron had been chosen for priestly service not because of personal ambition, but by God's appointment. The staff was preserved as a warning against further rebellion. Order returned to the camp. But the nation remained under judgment. Days became months. Months became years. The wilderness received the bodies of those who had refused the land. Children grew into adults as their parents' generation passed away. Joshua continued serving Moses. Caleb waited for the inheritance he had believed God would give. Aaron remained high priest. Miriam remained a prophetic voice within Israel, and Moses continued carrying the burden of a people he would lead toward a destination he had now seen only through the testimony of others. He had survived Pharaoh. He had crossed the sea. He had stood on Sinai. He had interceded after the golden calf and after the refusal at Canaan. Again and again, he had fallen before God to preserve the people who resisted him. But the wilderness had not finished testing Moses. The generation that left Egypt would die. A new generation would approach the promised land, and when they demanded water, the leader known for intercession would respond in anger. He would raise the staff. He would strike the rock. Water would come. But in that moment, Moses himself would lose the right to lead Israel across the Jordan. Moses' final failure and Israel's last journey. The wilderness had changed Israel. Children who had once walked beside their parents now stood as adults. The generation that left Egypt was disappearing one burial at a time. A new generation was preparing to inherit a promise first spoken centuries earlier to Abraham. But the leaders who had carried Israel through the Exodus were also approaching the end of their journeys. The people entered the wilderness of Zin and stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Scripture gives no extended description of her final days. It does not record a national speech, a farewell song, or a final conversation with Moses and Aaron. It simply tells us that she died, yet her absence carried the weight of an entire era. Miriam had watched over Moses' basket near the Nile. She had stood beside the Red Sea with a tambourine, leading Israel's women in celebration after Pharaoh's army was defeated. She had served as a prophetess and had also experienced correction when she challenged Moses' authority. Now at Kadesh, her journey ended. The sister who had helped preserve Moses' life would not enter the Promised Land. Soon after her death, the community found itself without water. Once again, the people gathered against Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said they wished they had died when others had died before the Lord. Why had Moses brought the assembly into the wilderness? Why had he led them and their livestock to a place without grain, figs, vines, pomegranates, or water? The complaint sounded familiar. A generation was passing away, but the language of distrust remained. Moses and Aaron withdrew from the assembly and went to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared. God instructed Moses to take the staff. He and Aaron were to gather the community. Then Moses was told to speak to the rock before the people, and water would come from it. Years earlier, at Rephidim, Moses had been commanded to strike a rock. Here, the instruction was different. He was to speak. Moses took the staff from before the Lord as commanded. He and Aaron gathered the people in front of the rock. But Moses did not simply repeat God's instruction. He spoke from accumulated frustration. "Listen, you rebels! Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water poured out abundantly. The people drank, their livestock drank, the need was met. But the miracle did not erase Moses' disobedience. God told Moses and Aaron that because they had not trusted him enough to honor him as holy before Israel, they would not bring the assembly into the land. The place became known again as Meribah, associated with quarreling, because Israel had contended with God and his holiness had been displayed among them. This judgment can seem severe until the responsibility of Moses is understood. He was not an inexperienced leader acting before he knew God's ways. He had stood at the burning bush. He had spoken with God on Sinai. He had carried the covenant tablets. He had represented God before Pharaoh and before Israel. At the rock, Moses' words blurred the source of the miracle. "Must we bring you water?" His anger toward the people shaped the way he represented God before them. He struck when commanded to speak. The man entrusted with revealing God's holiness failed at the very border of the promise. Scripture does not hide this failure. The Bible honors Moses without pretending that he was flawless. His long record of service did not make obedience unnecessary. His position did not place him above accountability. Water came because God remained faithful to Israel. But Moses would not cross the Jordan. The leader who had endured Pharaoh rebellion, idolatry, and decades of wandering had now received the judgment that would define the end of his life. Still, his work was not finished. Israel needed a route toward Canaan. Moses sent messengers to the king of Edom asking permission to pass through the territory. His message recalled Israel's suffering in Egypt and God's deliverance. He promised that the people would remain on the main road and avoid fields, vineyards, and wells. Edom refused. Moses offered to pay for any water used. Edom answered by coming out with a strong military force. Israel did not attack. Because the Edomites were descended from Esau, Jacob's brother, Israel was commanded to respect their territory. The nation turned away and followed another route. The detour increased the difficulty of the journey. Then Israel came to Mount Hor. There, God announced that Aaron's life was ending. Aaron would not enter Canaan because he had joined Moses in disobedience at the waters of Meribah. Moses was instructed to take Aaron and Aaron's son Eleazar up the mountain. Aaron's priestly garments were to be removed and placed upon Eleazar. The three men climbed in view of the community. Aaron had stood beside Moses from the beginning of the confrontation with Pharaoh. He had thrown down the staff. He had stretched out his hand during the plagues. He had spoken when Moses feared his own inability. He had also failed. He had helped make the golden calf. He had joined Miriam in challenging Moses. At Meribah, he had shared responsibility for dishonoring God, yet Aaron had also served as Israel's first high priest. He had carried the names of the tribes on his garments. He had entered the sanctuary on behalf of the people. He had once stood with incense between the dead and the living until a plague stopped. Now his priestly garments were transferred to his son. The office continued, even though the man who first held it did not. Aaron died on the mountain. Moses and Eleazar descended without him. When the people saw that Aaron was gone, the entire community mourned for 30 days. Miriam was dead. Aaron was dead. Moses remained, but he knew that his own death would come before Israel entered the land. The old leadership was passing away. A new generation had to carry the covenant forward. Soon the king of Arad in the Negev heard that Israel was approaching. He attacked and captured some of the people. Israel made a vow, asking God to deliver the enemy into their hands. Victory was granted, and the Canaanite settlements involved were destroyed. The victory showed that the new generation was not condemned to repeat every failure of its parents. But faith remained unstable. As Israel traveled around Edom, the people became impatient with the difficult route. They spoke against God and Moses. Why had they been brought out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There was no bread, no water, and they despised the miserable food. The manna that had preserved Israel for decades was once again treated with contempt. Then venomous serpents appeared among the people. Many were bitten, and some died. The community came to Moses and confessed, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you." They asked Moses to pray for the serpents to be removed. Moses interceded. God instructed him to make the image of a serpent and place it on a pole. Anyone who had been bitten could look at it and live. Moses made a bronze serpent and lifted it above the camp. Those who looked upon it in trust were healed. The object had no independent power. It was the sign God had appointed within the crisis. Much later, Jesus would refer to this event when explaining that just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, the Son of Man would be lifted up, so that those who believed might receive life. That New Testament connection does not make every detail of the wilderness episode a direct prediction, but it identifies the raised serpent as a pattern people facing death were called to look in faith toward the means God provided. Israel continued northward. The nation moved through a region of valleys, rivers, and contested borders. They approached the territory controlled by Sihon, king of the Amorites. Moses sent messengers requesting peaceful passage. Israel would remain on the king's highway. The people would not enter fields or vineyards or drink from wells without permission. They asked only to pass through the territory. Sihon refused. He gathered his army and marched against Israel. The battle took place at Jahaz. Israel defeated him and occupied his territory from the Arnon River toward the Jabbok. The towns and settlements of the Amorites came under Israel's control. The people who had once trembled before reports of fortified Canaanite cities had now defeated an established king east of the Jordan. The victory was not yet the conquest of Canaan itself, but it changed Israel's position. They were no longer only wanderers moving between camps. They now controlled territory. Then Israel turned toward Bashan. Og, king of Bashan, came out with his army to fight them at Edrei. His kingdom was known for strong cities and formidable power. God told Moses not to be afraid. Og and his land would be delivered into Israel's hands, just as Sihon had been. Israel defeated Og, his sons, and his army. His territory was taken. The victories over Sihon and Og became part of Israel's memory. Later generations would recall them as evidence that the nations ahead were not beyond God's power. The lands east of the Jordan would eventually be given to the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh, on the condition that their fighting men cross the river and help the other tribes secure their inheritance. But military success created new fears among Israel's neighbors. The Israelites moved into the plains of Moab and camped beside the Jordan across from Jericho. From there, Canaan was visible. The destination that had governed their journey stood directly ahead. Balak, king of Moab, saw what Israel had done to the Amorites. He feared that the enormous camp would consume the surrounding region like an ox devouring grass. Balak did not initially confront Israel with an army. He sought a spiritual weapon. He sent messengers to Balaam, a diviner living far away, asking him to come and curse Israel. Balak believed that those Balaam blessed would be blessed, and those he cursed would be cursed. The story of Balaam is complex. He was not an Israelite prophet in the same sense as Moses, yet God spoke to him and restricted what he could say. Balaam was warned not to curse Israel because the people were blessed. Balak sent increasingly important officials and offered greater rewards. Balaam eventually went, but only under the command that he speak what God gave him. On the journey, Balaam's donkey saw an angel standing in the road with a drawn sword. Balaam did not see the danger. The animal turned aside. Balaam struck it. The donkey pressed against a wall. Balaam struck it again. Finally, the animal lay down beneath him, and Balaam struck it a third time. Then God enabled the donkey to speak. The creature asked why Balaam had beaten it. Only afterward were Balaam's eyes opened, and he saw the angel in the road. The seer had been unable to see what the animal recognized. Balaam was warned again that his path was reckless, and that he must speak only the words God provided. Balak brought him to places from which he could view portions of Israel's camp. Altars were built. Sacrifices were offered. Again and again, Balak expected a curse. Again and again, Balaam pronounced blessing. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? He declared that Israel was a people set apart. He saw no enchantment capable of overturning what God had determined. Balak became angry. He changed locations, perhaps hoping a different view would produce a different result. But Israel could not be cursed merely because a frightened king paid a diviner. One of Balaam's oracles looked beyond the immediate moment and spoke of a star coming out of Jacob and a scepter rising from Israel. The precise scope of the oracle has been interpreted in different ways, but it clearly announced future royal power arising from Israel and defeating hostile nations. Balak had asked for Israel's destruction. He received proclamations of Israel's future. Yet the danger did not disappear when the curses failed. Israel soon became entangled with Moabite women and participated in sacrifices to their gods. The people joined themselves to Baal of Peor. What Balak could not accomplish through spoken curses began to happen through seduction and idolatry. The threat outside the camp became compromise within it. God's anger burned, and a plague struck Israel. Moses ordered judgment against those who had joined the idolatry. In the midst of the crisis, an Israelite man openly brought a Midianite woman into the camp before Moses and the grieving assembly. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron, acted decisively against the public rebellion. The plague stopped, but 24,000 people had died. Israel had again reached the edge of promise and nearly destroyed itself through unfaithfulness. The conflict with Midian did not end there. God commanded Moses to take vengeance upon the Midianites for their role in leading Israel into sin. Moses was told that after this final campaign, he would be gathered to his people. The announcement connected victory with mortality. Moses would complete one more major task. Then his life would end. An army was sent under the leadership of Phinehas, carrying sacred objects and signaling trumpets. The Midianite forces were defeated, and the leaders associated with the campaign against Israel were killed. Balaam also died. When the soldiers returned with captives and plunder, Moses became angry because women connected to the seduction at Peor had been spared. Instructions were given concerning judgment, purification, and the distribution of the captured goods. The campaign was severe, reflecting the brutal conditions of ancient warfare and the theological portrayal of judgment against those who had deliberately sought Israel's spiritual destruction. The narrative does not present war as a spectacle detached from moral consequence. It shows a world in which rebellion, violence, idolatry, and judgment repeatedly produced death. After the campaign, the commanders reported that none of Israel's soldiers under their authority was missing. They brought an offering from the captured valuables as acknowledgement before God. The tribes of Reuben and Gad owned large herds and saw that the territories east of the Jordan were suitable for livestock. They asked Moses to give them that land rather than an inheritance across the river. Moses initially feared that their request would repeat the failure at Kadesh. Would they remain behind while the other tribes fought? Would their reluctance discourage Israel as the spies had discouraged the previous generation? The tribal leaders promised to build protected settlements for their families, then send their armed men across the Jordan. They would remain with Israel until the other tribes received their inheritance. Moses accepted the arrangement under that condition. Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh received territory conquered from Sihon and Og, but their warriors remained obligated to join the coming campaign. Israel was now camped directly across from Jericho. The people could see the land. The generations standing there had survived the wilderness. They had defeated kings. They had received instructions for dividing the inheritance. The tribes were being counted, organized, and prepared. But Moses would not cross with them. He climbed a mountain in the Abarim range and looked toward the land. God told him that after seeing it, he too would be gathered to his people as Aaron had been. The reason was stated again at Meribah. Moses and Aaron had rebelled against God's command and failed to uphold his holiness before Israel. Moses did not respond by asking for the judgment to be transferred to someone else. His concern turned toward the nation. He asked God to appoint a leader over the community, someone who would go out before them and come in before them, someone who would lead them so they would not be like sheep without a shepherd. After decades of carrying the people, Moses understood exactly what the next leader would face. God chose Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom was the Spirit. Moses was instructed to place his hand upon him and commission him before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly. Some of Moses' authority would be placed upon Joshua so that Israel would listen to him. Joshua had fought Amalek. He had remained near Moses at Sinai. He had explored Canaan. He had stood with Caleb when the nation refused to enter. He had waded through the wilderness years. Now he was being prepared to lead Israel across the river Moses could not cross. The succession was becoming visible. The mission did not belong permanently to Moses. God's purpose would continue through another servant. But before Joshua assumed full leadership, Moses still had words to speak. The nation needed more than military orders. The people needed to remember why their parents had died in the wilderness. They needed to understand the covenant before receiving fields they had not planted and cities they had not built. They needed warning against the idols of Canaan and instruction for life beyond the desert. Moses had led Israel out of Egypt. His final task would be to prepare Israel to live without him. On the plains of Moab, with Jericho across the Jordan and the mountains of Canaan rising beyond it, Moses gathered the people. The shepherd who once claimed he could not speak was about to deliver the longest final address of his life. He would retell their history. He would set before them blessing and curse, life and death. He would commission Joshua. He would teach Israel a final song. And then he would climb one last mountain, see the land with his own eyes, and die outside the promise he had spent 40 years leading others toward. The final words of Moses. Israel stood on the plains of Moab with the Jordan River before them. Across the water lay Jericho, the first fortified city they would face inside Canaan. Beyond it stretched the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The people were close enough to see the destination. But before they crossed, Moses gathered them to listen. The man who had once protested that he was slow of speech now stood before an entire nation and delivered the final words of his life. These speeches form the heart of the book of Deuteronomy. The name means a repetition or restatement of a law. But Moses did not merely recite old commands. He interpreted Israel's history for a generation preparing to live in a new land. Most of those listening had been children when Israel left Egypt, or they had been born during the wilderness years. They knew the story, but many had not personally stood at Sinai when the covenant was first announced. Their parents had seen the plagues, their parents had crossed the sea, their parents had heard the thunder from the mountain. Their parents had also refused to enter Canaan. Now the children stood where the previous generation had failed. Moses began by retelling the journey. He recalled how Israel left Horeb and approached the hill country of the Amorites. He reminded the people that the land had been placed before them and that they had been commanded not to fear. Then he described the decision to send spies. The spies entered the land and returned carrying its fruit. They said the land was good, but Israel refused to go up. The people complained in their tents and accused God of bringing them out of Egypt because he hated them. Fear had not remained a private emotion. It became a false interpretation of God's character. The people saw fortified cities and powerful inhabitants and concluded that the God who defeated Egypt intended to destroy them. Moses reminded the new generation that he had urged their parents not to be terrified. The Lord who went before Israel would fight for them, just as he had done in Egypt. In the wilderness, God had carried them as a father carries his son. Yet they would not believe. The judgment that followed was not disconnected from the rebellion. The people had said their children would become victims. God declared that those children would inherit the land, while the unbelieving generation died outside it. Moses also acknowledged his own exclusion. Because of you, he told them, the Lord was angry with me also, and said, you shall not enter there. The statement did not erase Moses' personal responsibility at Meribah. Deuteronomy repeatedly makes clear that Moses would not cross because he had failed to honor God as holy. Yet his words also reflected the burden of leadership within a rebellious community. Moses' failure occurred after decades of absorbing Israel's accusations, crises, and resistance. The Bible allows both realities to stand. The people had repeatedly provoked him. Moses was still accountable for how he responded. He continued tracing Israel's movement around Edom, through the eastern territories, and into the lands once ruled by Sihon and Og. These recent victories were evidence that the nations west of the Jordan could also be defeated. Joshua had seen what God did to those kings. the same God would go before him into Canaan. Moses then turned from history to warning. Israel was not to add to God's commands or take away from them. The people were to obey carefully so that surrounding nations would see wisdom in their laws. No other nation had a God as near as the Lord was when Israel called upon him. No other people had received such instructions concerning worship, justice, family, and community life. But privilege created danger. The people had to watch themselves carefully so that they would not forget what they had seen. They were to teach these things to their children and grandchildren. The Exodus generation had often treated memory as optional. When food or water became scarce, the people forgot Egypt's cruelty and imagined that slavery had been comfortable. Moses now made remembrance a covenant responsibility. Israel was to remember the day at Horeb when God spoke from the fire. The people heard his voice but saw no form. For that reason, they were not to create an image and claim that it represented God. They were not to worship the sun, moon, stars, animals, or anything else within creation. The Creator could not be reduced to something human hands could shape. Moses warned that if Israel entered the land, became secure, and turned to idols, the people would eventually be scattered among the nations. Canaan would not protect them from the consequences of covenant rebellion. Possessing the land was not the same as possessing God. Yet even the warning of exile contained hope. If the people later sought God with all their heart and soul, they would find him. God was merciful and would not forget the covenant made with their ancestors. Long before Israel entered Canaan, Moses looked beyond settlement toward the possibility of failure, judgment, and return. The covenant story would continue through both blessing and discipline. Moses restated the 10 Commandments. Again, the law began with redemption. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Israel's identity did not begin with its military achievements or ownership of land. It began with deliverance. The people were to worship no other gods, reject idols, honor God's name, observe the Sabbath, respect parents, protect life and marriage, respect property, speak truthfully, and resist covetous desire. Then Moses gave Israel words that would become central to Jewish faith and worship. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The people were commanded to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. These words were to remain upon their hearts. They were to teach them diligently to their children. When sitting at home, walking along the road, lying down and rising, God's commands were not intended to remain only inside a sanctuary or appear only during national ceremonies. They were to enter ordinary life, conversation, family routines, work, travel, rest. The covenant would survive only if one generation intentionally taught the next. Moses warned the people about prosperity. Soon they would enter cities they had not built, live in houses filled with goods they had not produced, drink from wells they had not dug, and eat from vineyards and olive trees they had not planted. Scarcity had tested Israel in the wilderness. Abundance would test them in Canaan. When the people became satisfied, they might forget the God who brought them out of Egypt. That danger was more subtle than Pharaoh's chariots. An enemy could make Israel cry out to God. Comfort could persuade them that they no longer needed him. Moses told the people not to imagine that they were receiving Canaan because of their own righteousness. The nations of the land were facing judgment for persistent wickedness, and God was remaining faithful to the promises made to Israel's ancestors. Israel itself had repeatedly demonstrated stubbornness. Moses reminded them of the golden calf, their complaints, their refusal at Kadesh, and the many times he had interceded for them. The history was not retold to humiliate the people. It was meant to remove pride. Their future would depend upon mercy and covenant faithfulness, not a false belief in their moral superiority. "What does the Lord your God ask of you?" Moses said. "To fear him, to walk in his ways, to love him, to serve him with heart and soul, to keep his commands for their good." The God of Israel was described as the God of gods and Lord of lords, mighty and impartial. He defended the cause of the fatherless and widow and loved the foreigner. Therefore, Israel was also to love the foreigner. They had been foreigners in Egypt. A redeemed people was not to become another Egypt. They were not to use their freedom to create new systems of exploitation. The law Moses presented touched every level of national life. Worship was to be directed toward the place God chose, preventing Israel from treating every Canaanite shrine as acceptable. Idolatrous practices were forbidden. False prophets were not to be followed merely because they displayed impressive signs. Israel was given regulations concerning clean and unclean food, tithes, debt release, servants, festivals, judges, kings, priests, warfare, property, marriage, family responsibility, and care for the poor. The laws belonged to the specific covenant life of ancient Israel. They cannot all be transferred directly into modern societies without considering their original setting. But together, they reveal the kind of community Israel was called to become. A society where worship shaped justice, where rulers remained under law, where witnesses were required before conviction, where the poor were not to be permanently crushed by debt, where landowners left portions of harvest for foreigners, widows, and orphans, where dishonest weights were condemned, where human life was treated seriously, where power did not place a king above accountability. Moses anticipated that Israel would eventually ask for a king like the surrounding nations. The king was not to multiply horses, wives, or excessive wealth. He was not to send the people back toward Egypt to increase military strength. He was to write for himself a copy of the law and read it throughout his life so that he would learn humility and obedience. The throne would remain beneath the covenant. Israel's future kings would often fail precisely in these areas. They would multiply wealth, form political marriages, trust military power, lead the nation toward idols. Moses' warning stood centuries before the monarchy as a measure by which later rulers would be judged. Moses also spoke of prophets. God would raise up a prophet from among Israel, and the people were to listen. In its immediate setting, the promise established the continuing role of prophetic leadership after Moses. Israel would not need to seek diviners and occult practices like surrounding nations, because God would speak through appointed messengers. Later scripture would look back on this promise with greater expectation. In the New Testament, it was applied to Jesus, who was presented not merely as another prophet in succession, but as the decisive one to whom Moses' words ultimately pointed. The connection did not erase the original meaning. It showed how the pattern of a God-appointed mediator and prophet continued forward. Moses then described blessings connected to covenant faithfulness. Israel would experience security, fruitful harvests, growing families, and victory over enemies. The people would become a visible testimony among nations. But he also described curses connected to rebellion, disease, drought, defeat, confusion, siege, loss of land, exile. The warnings became increasingly severe. Moses portrayed a future in which Israel could be removed from the very land it was about to enter. The contrast was intentional. Canaan was a gift, but it was not permission to abandon the giver. The nation could not assume that the presence of sacred history, priesthood, or territory would shield it while it imitated the injustice and idolatry of the nations. Much later, Israel's prophets would repeat these covenant warnings. When the northern kingdom fell to Assyria, and Judah was carried into Babylonian exile, The disasters would not appear without explanation. Moses had already warned what persistent rebellion could produce. Yet judgment would not speak the final word. Moses described a time when Israel, scattered among the nations, would remember the covenant and return to God. God would restore the people, gather them, and transform their hearts so that they could love Him fully. The law had revealed what Israel should be. Their history would reveal that commands alone could not remove stubbornness from the human heart. The hope of restoration, therefore, reached deeper than a return to geography. It pointed toward inward renewal. Moses gathered the people into a formal covenant renewal. Leaders, elders, officials, men, women, children, and foreigners living within the camp all stood together. The covenant was not being made only with visible leaders. It embraced the community and the generations that would come after them. Moses warned against anyone secretly believing that he could persist in idolatry while remaining safe beneath the blessings spoken over the nation. Hidden rebellion would still carry consequences. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, Moses declared, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law. Israel was not responsible for mastering every mystery. They were responsible for obeying what had been revealed. Then Moses placed the choice before them with extraordinary clarity. Life and prosperity stood on one side, death and destruction stood on the other. To love God, walk in His ways, and remain faithful would lead toward life in the land. To turn toward other gods would lead toward ruin. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Then came the appeal, choose life. The command was not merely a call for physical survival. To choose life meant to love God, listen to His voice, and remain connected to the one who was Israel's life. Moses was now 120 years old. He told the people that he could no longer lead them across the Jordan. God had declared that he would not enter, but Israel would not cross alone. The Lord would go before them. Joshua would lead them. Moses called Joshua before the nation, "Be strong and courageous." Joshua was not to fear the nations of Canaan because God would neither leave nor forsake him. The words were not based on Joshua's personality. Courage came from the presence that had guided Israel since Egypt. Moses wrote down the law and entrusted it to the priests and elders. Every 7 years during the Feast of Tabernacles, it was to be read publicly before the entire nation. Men, women, children, and foreigners were to hear it. Israel's future could not depend on the law remaining hidden among specialists. The covenant had to be heard by the people. God then summoned Moses and Joshua to the tent of meeting. The pillar of cloud appeared. Moses was told that after his death, Israel would turn toward foreign gods and break the covenant. Disaster would come, and the people would recognize that their suffering was connected to their abandonment of God. Moses was commanded to write a song and teach it to Israel. The song would become a witness across generations. Songs travel where speeches may be forgotten. Their words enter memory through rhythm and repetition. Moses' final song began by calling heaven and earth to listen. He proclaimed God as the rock, whose work is perfect and whose ways are just. He contrasted God's faithfulness with Israel's corruption. The song recalled how God found Israel in a wilderness, guarded the people, and carried them like an eagle protecting its young. But it warned that prosperity would lead Israel toward complacency. The people would grow satisfied, abandon the God who made them, and provoke him with idols. Judgment would follow. Yet God would ultimately defend his name and confront Israel's enemies and show compassion upon his servants. The song was not optimistic about human consistency. Its hope rested in God's character. Moses taught it to the people with Joshua beside him. Afterward, he told Israel to take every word seriously and command their children to obey. These are not idle words for you, he said. They are your life. Then Moses blessed the tribes. Like Jacob blessing his sons before death, Moses spoke over Israel before the nation entered its inheritance. He began by describing God coming from Sinai with majesty. He prayed for Reuben's survival. He asked that Judah's voice be heard. He honored Levi's priestly responsibility. He spoke of Benjamin's security, Joseph's abundance, Zebulun and Issachar's prosperity, Gad's strength, Dan's courage, Naphtali's favor, and Asher's provision. The blessings were poetic, and not every detail can be connected with certainty to later events. But together they showed Israel moving forward, not as an undefined crowd, but as distinct tribes sharing one covenant destiny. Moses ended by declaring that no one was like the God of Israel. He rode across the heavens to help his people. The eternal God was their refuge. His everlasting arms were beneath them. Israel's security would not ultimately rest in fortified walls, military numbers, or fertile land. Their security rested in the God who had carried them from Egypt. Then the time came. Moses left the plains of Moab and climbed Mount Nebo, ascending to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. The climb was the final movement of his life. Below him lay the camp of Israel. Beyond the Jordan lay Canaan. From the mountain, God showed Moses the land from northern regions to the areas stretching westward and southward, including the territory near Jericho. This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God told him. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross into it. Moses could see the promise. He could not possess it. For 40 years he had carried Israel toward this destination. He had confronted Pharaoh when the people were slaves. He had announced the Passover. He had led them through the sea. He had climbed Sinai and carried the covenant tablets. He had interceded after idolatry and rebellion. He had endured complaints, threats, grief, and isolation. He had buried his sister. He had watched his brother die. He had appointed his successor. Now Moses stood without the nation around him, looking across the land into which Joshua would lead them. There is no recorded final speech from the mountain. No account describes Moses protesting again. Deuteronomy simply states that Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, according to God's word. He was 120 years old. His eyesight was not weak, and his natural strength had not entirely left him. His death was not described as the collapse of a powerless man. It came at the boundary God had established. Moses was buried in a valley in Moab, but the location of his grave was not known. No shrine could be built around his remains. The leader whose life had shaped Israel's identity disappeared from public reach. The people mourned him for 30 days. Then the period of mourning ended. Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him. Israel listened to Joshua and prepared to cross the Jordan. The mission continued. The book of Deuteronomy closes by declaring that no prophet had arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. The statement honors his unique role in Israel's founding history. Moses had performed signs before Pharaoh. He had led the nation out of slavery. He had mediated the covenant and delivered the law. He had stood between Israel and judgment. He had spoken with unusual intimacy before God. Yet Moses himself knew that the story would continue beyond him. He had promised that God would raise up another prophet. Later biblical writers repeatedly returned to Moses. The Psalms remembered the Exodus and wilderness. The prophets used the covenant given through Moses to confront Israel's injustice and idolatry. Israel's kings were judged according to the law associated with Moses. After exile, Ezra publicly read the law to a restored community. By the time of the New Testament, Moses had become inseparable from the language of Israel's scripture and identity. Jesus spoke about Moses and the law. He affirmed that Moses had written about him, while also distinguishing his own authority and mission. At the Transfiguration, Moses appeared with Elijah as Jesus' glory was revealed. Moses represented the law, while Elijah represented the prophets. Yet the heavenly voice directed the disciples to listen to Jesus. The Gospel of John states that the law was given through Moses, while grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. This was not an attack on Moses. It placed his genuine covenant role within a larger story reaching its fulfillment. The letter to the Hebrews honors Moses as faithful within God's household as a servant, but it presents Jesus as the son over the household. Moses led Israel out of physical slavery. Jesus was proclaimed as bringing deliverance from sin and death. Moses mediated the covenant at Sinai. Jesus was identified as the mediator of the new covenant. Moses lifted the bronze serpent so that dying Israelites could look and live. Jesus spoke of his own lifting up as the means through which believers would receive eternal life. These connections do not turn Moses into Jesus or make every event a direct prophecy. They reveal a pattern of deliverance, mediation, covenant intercession, and divine presence that the New Testament understands as reaching a greater fulfillment in Christ. Moses' life therefore stands at the center of the biblical story without becoming its final destination. He was rescued from death, but he could not rescue Israel from the rebellion of its own heart. He delivered the law, but he could not make the people permanently obedient. He interceded, but he could not personally remove all guilt. He led Israel to the border, but another leader had to take them across. Even Moses needed mercy. His greatness did not come from perfection. It came from being called, corrected, sustained, and used by God across a lifetime of extraordinary responsibility. He began as an infant hidden from Pharaoh. He became a prince within the house that oppressed his people. He became a murderer and fugitive. He became a shepherd in Midian. He returned as a reluctant prophet. He stood before Pharaoh. He led slaves through the sea. He received the covenant on the mountain. He became Israel's judge, teacher, intercessor, and servant. Then at the edge of the promised land, he laid down leadership and died. He did not enter Canaan. But without Moses, Israel would not have stood at the Jordan prepared to enter. His life ended outside the land, yet the covenant moved forward. His grave remained hidden, yet his words were carried into every generation that followed. The palace did not define him. The wilderness did not erase him. His failure did not cancel the entire purpose of his life. And death did not end the story he had been called to serve. Moses saw the promise from a distance. Joshua would cross the river. Israel would enter the land. Kings, prophets, priests, exiles, and returning generations would all live within the history Moses helped establish. The child Pharaoh tried to destroy became the servant through whom an enslaved people learned that no empire, no wilderness, and no human weakness could erase a promise God had chosen to remember. If you followed Moses' journey to the end, tell us which biblical figure or book should receive the complete documentary treatment next. Subscribe to continue the Complete Bible Stories series and watch the next episode to see how Joshua led Israel across the Jordan and into Canaan. Moses' journey ended at the mountain, but the promise continued beyond the river.